Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we are talking with Brad Birzer about his new book, In Defense of Andrew Jackson. Brad Birzer is a professor of history and the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College. He is the author of a number of books, including most recently, Russell Kirk, American Conservative, which he appeared on Liberty Law Talk a year and a half ago to discuss. He's also the author of American Cicero, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth. Brad Birzer, glad to have you on the program.
Richard, thanks so much. I always love talking to you, and I hope you know how much I appreciate the incredible work you do.
Oh, well, thank you.
For Liberty Fund, on Twitter, everything. I follow you very closely.
We've got social media covered. No, we've got it covered.
Yeah, you're good, and you stay really even. I'm always impressed with that. I wish I could be a little more moderate in my views sometimes. So I admire you very much.
All right, I like that.
No, you're principled but even. It's great.
Okay, good.
It's really nice.
Now, let me ask you, so your extended biography, you teach a class, Jacksonian America, at Hillsdale College. So you know this period of American history really well, and you know Andrew Jackson really well. But what got you interested in writing a book about Jackson?
Yeah, so Richard, I've been teaching now at Hillsdale for 19 years, and so that course, Jacksonian America, is one of our standard survey courses for junior and senior history majors and anyone else who wants to take it. But I teach that. It's in such demand at Hillsdale. It's pretty amazing that I teach it with two colleagues. We don't team teach, but Paul Marino, I know you know, and also David Remini. And so we switch off, and David and I actually teach. We do the sequence of American Revolution or American Founding, then Jacksonian, and then Civil War. So I love being able to do that and really put it into context. But Jacksonian America, I got interested in a long time ago, mostly through my work in graduate school on American Indians and working with people like Dave Edmonds and Bernard Sheehan and Gregory Dowd at Notre Dame, some people I really liked and admired. So I got interested in the subject actually as kind of an anti-Jackson scholar, and I taught really the whole Jacksonian period much more from the standpoint of, say, Nathaniel Hawthorne, in good Kirkian fashion. And also I taught it as John Quincy Adams rather than Andrew Jackson. So I was a bit surprised but happy. The whole reason I wrote the book, I don't think I would have thought of it otherwise. I had been contacted by Harry Crocker at Remini, and they were looking for somebody to write a relatively pro-biography of Jackson. Mm-hmm. And they asked me if I could do it. And when I said, well, I'd be happy to look into it. I don't know how pro I can be. But we agreed to it, and Harry was fantastic. So the title is really more of a marketing title, the scholarly one, obviously. But Harry was fantastic, and that was all through John Miller, that contact to Harry. And now Harry and I have become friends. I really think the world of him in all kinds of ways.
Now, I want to read first paragraph of the last chapter in the book, and just get your comment. So you say, it seems clear that earlier historians who ranked Jackson highly as a president were right. He was surely one of the most consequential and principled presidents in American history. If Jackson has become unfashionable, it is not because we have outgrown his virtues, but because we have need of them. What were those virtues?
You know, for me, the most important thing, and I think there's still, no matter what, Richard, I'm sure you would agree to this, and anybody I think who's right-minded would agree, there are things to really dislike about Jackson. But there are also things that I think are really worth liking. And most importantly, I found, no matter how violent he was, and he was just outrageously violent, I don't think there's any question about that, but he was just so honest in the way that he approached things. And I found him in kind of the way that when American studies first started in the late 1940s and 1950s, there were people like Henry Nash Smith really looking for an American character. I'm not sure if that's really possible anymore. That's such a Cold War artifact. But if we wanted to do that, I think Jackson, like Daniel Boone, like the fictional Natty Bumppo, I think he is one of those characters. He was incredibly violent, but he would never be violent without first warning you. There was a kind of honesty in a very small R Republican way that I thought was great about him. And the thing that follows that up with that, for me, Richard, that's so important is he really was truly, no matter how much we might label him a big D Democrat, he really was a small R Republican. I think it was kind of a naive republicanism at times. I think it was a kind of untutored republicanism, but he really did believe in a republic in the old Roman sense, but with kind of frontier sensibilities. So that honesty tied with his republicanism, I found him, I could still keep reading about him. I did not get tired, even though I wrote that biography maybe too quickly, but I wouldn't get tired of reading more about him. And I'm almost sorry that I spent 19 years or 18 years of my life kind of dismissing him. Now that I've found him, I think he's just outstanding.
Yeah, no, one of the biggest historians to spend time writing Andrew Jackson, Robert Remini, three volumes on Andrew Jackson. What do you make of his assessment of Jackson in Writings and Argument?
Overall, I thought Remini was great. He's an old-fashioned historian, of course. He's not a cookie-cutter historian like I think Schlesinger could be at times. He definitely was his own person, even though I think he leaned pretty much towards the kind of tapioca, mediocre leftism of a lot of historians without being a full-fledged leftist. So I like Remini a lot. I think there were a lot of times that his Catholic Italian sensibilities overrode his kind of quasi-conformist leftism. So I think he was a really good historian, and I enjoy reading him. Certainly, he knew the documents. I think any of us who would dismiss his views, I think we would be doing so only basically to our own detriment. I think he's very well worth taking seriously, even if we might disagree here or there. And there were certainly things that I took chances on, for better or worse. For example, the whole idea that Jackson's first wedding was a Catholic wedding, that Remini said, no, that just can't be. And he looked at the same evidence that I did. And, he had done it a lot longer. I'm not certain I'm right about that. I was willing to take the chance and make that argument. Remini had clearly spent much more time looking at that evidence and thinking about it. So, I think if someone would say, look, Remini's right on that, Brad, am wrong, I'm not going to be in any way taken aback. I think there's definitely a legitimate argument to be made there.
Yeah. So thinking about the historians, and you mentioned Schlesinger. Schlesinger wanted to use Jackson as a part of he was looking for pre-New Deal leftist progressive antecedents in American history, and so saw Jackson as a part of that cause and brought him in that way. But that brings to mind, Jackson highly ranked by many historians up to the middle of the 20th century as a great American president, great American leader, character. And he certainly resonated. We were talking about this before we started this interview. I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, and I was really taught to revere him. And I making trips to see the Hermitage, Jackson's Nashville home. I grew up near a large inn where Jackson used to race horses. And this was just sort of, and I knew I knew about the Trail of Tears. I knew about being a slave owner. I knew about the dueling, that he had killed men at times in duels rather than just fire in the air, and all of this. But this was just a man of great action, of great leadership. And then whiplash. Here we are, and I'm an adult, and he's being removed from the currency, and he's a racist, and he's a horrible person, and he's part of this American history we should somehow be ashamed of or embarrassed of. And in your reading your book, it was funny. It sort of brought back to me a lot of the sentiments that I had received growing up. But thinking about just this more on a direct level, what started the unraveling of Andrew Jackson as a great American man?
Such a good question, and I love the way you gave some background to your question as well, Richard, and the fact that you grew up with this. My only equivalent growing up in Kansas. Kansans are extremely proud of their history, and I don't think a lot of people outside of Kansas would know that. But one of the things I grew up with, just revering John Brown. When I got to college and started reading about it, it's like, well, we have had some good intentions, but yeah. So, I think one of the great things about Jackson, and it's also one of the detrimental things about him, he's so much larger than life. And so it is very easy to mythologize him and to make him either kind of the ultimate American in the good sense or the ultimate American in the bad sense. So there was really, in the 1960s, right after Schlesinger, court historian, we have 30 years of Bernard DeVoto, and people like Schlesinger writing so positively about these figures. And then you get the New Left come in. And I don't think they're all wrong, but what the New Left criticized, of course, was this combination of imperialism and capitalism as they saw it. And for them, there could be no worse person in American history than Andrew Jackson. I mean, he was, in so many ways, the ultimate representative of all the horrors of American history in terms of Indian removal. And that kind of crept into our history slowly, I think really, really slowly. And so even as late as 1996, as you noted, there were surveys going on with mainstream historians saying, look, he's one of the great presidents. And then suddenly here we are, 22 years later, and he's reviled, absolutely reviled. And it's hard, even at a place like Hillsdale, where I'm getting really, generally very religious, very conservative homeschool kids. Almost everything they've been taught from the textbooks, whether it's the standard textbook at a public school or the history of us or homeschoolers, everything is Jackson is just bad. And so they hardly get any view of him. And part of what I tried to do in the book, and whether I was successful or not, I think is debatable, but rather than calling it an in defense of Jackson, which is kind of saying, punch me on the chin and let's see where we go from there, I think a better title or a more accurate title, but not a marketable title, would have been something like In Context with Andrew Jackson. So I think there are things to dislike, but there's so much to like as well. And we do a disservice not only to ourselves, but to him, when we just dismiss him outright. In the same way, I think Schlesinger was kind of foolish to praise him so much. There's a lot to like, and then there is a lot to dislike, and I think we have to be careful about that. But your question itself, Richard, it's just such a perfect question. Why one extreme to the other? I think he's just so mythic that we can put far more onto him than he's actually responsible for. And that's kind of the way he lived. Everything was bigger than he was. So I've tried to explain this, and this works for my generation, a little bit for yours, Richard. I know you're younger than I am. It works a lot better for my parents' generation. I tend to think of Jackson as a very much a John Wayne kind of figure. Not John Wayne in real life, but John Wayne in the movies. Whether we're looking at Stagecoach or The Searchers, this kind of hero, anti-hero figure. Really his own man, but in being his own man, there's a lot to be worried about, too. There's a strict individualism there that would make someone like a Robert Nisbet or a Russell Kirk very uncomfortable, and understandably so.
Yeah, no, and this is my next question. You sort of anticipated it. You said maybe a better title for your book would have been In Context. So The Trail of Tears, Indian removal. Put that in context for us. Andrew Jackson making these decisions. What did he mean to do? What actually happened? Was he satisfied with it?
Yes. He didn't talk about it a lot, which is interesting. After it happened, in fact, once he got the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830, there really wasn't a lot more discussion. I think he, for better or worse, and probably for worse, I think he thought once it was in place, it would have a life of its own. And I don't know, I can say for certain he didn't anticipate the horrors that resulted from it, but that doesn't necessarily excuse him either by any means. So he had worked all through the 1820s, whether it was behind the scenes or then when he comes into the White House in 1829, he had really worked to get this Indian Removal Act passed. And the goal of the Removal Act was to take all of the old tribes of the East Coast, so not quite East Coast, it's a little too broad, but really between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and to take them to that kind of imaginary line, really the 98th meridian, not quite that imaginary, but not a political line, to take them beyond the 98th meridian, roughly where Lincoln goes down to Topeka, Kansas, down to Tulsa, and put the Indians somewhere along that area. So on the other side of the Missouri River, but not quite all the way to the Rockies, really seeing the Great Plains as a kind of Indian reserve. That was a debatable point all the way from George Washington, really up until after the American Civil War, where Oklahoma was still seen as a reserve for the American Indians until it became a state. So that was a debatable idea for well over 100 years. Jackson thought that with the demographic shifts in both the North and the South, that the Indians that were in those regions, especially what we call, and maybe not correctly, but we still remember them as the civilized tribes in the South, like the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Choctaw, he thought that with the demographic changes, both among blacks and whites, that the Indians would simply be outcompeted, that they were not able to have the kind of procreative rates that Native white and black Americans were having, and he thought they were doomed. So his argument was, look, it's one way or the other. Either we suffocate them out of existence through demographic change in the South, or we get them out of the way and allow them some space to basically get their culture up to snuff, as he would have seen it, to get it to the level of American culture. And that was really his goal. Richard, I don't want to, you can cut me off anytime. I'm probably rambling on here too long. But at the time, and this amazed me, and I didn't know this until I wrote the book, Jackson was seen as a moderate on this issue, an absolute moderate. And there were people all along the East Coast who were furious with Jackson over Indian removal, not because they thought it was inhumane, but because he was taking tax dollars, huge tax dollars and layouts from white people and spending it on Indians, giving them prime land right on the edge of the Great Plains, and they were furious. Yeah. That's amazing to me. I mean, I'm just still astounded by that. It's like, wow, this is so different than now.
I wanted you to go on there because I want everyone listening to this podcast to get the context of this. Also, the question emerges. Jackson thought there was precedent for his concern of members of Indian tribes being overrun or not having a place really to thrive, and that was in the New England area. Certain tribes there being falling extinct, or losing their identity, their tribal identity. So that was not just something he made up or some sort of spurious justification, but actually had real resonance, he thought. Also, Jackson has Indian fighter. Also has come under criticism for being too ruthless and a savage, leading savage wars against Indian tribes and what was in the Southwest, what we would call the Southeast.
Sure.
And one in particular, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. But yet, what's the context there?
Right. Well, so in that case, of course, and here I think we do have to be really nuanced. There was nothing that we could say that Jackson was anti-Indian in the sense of maybe modern racism, right? That wasn't in his mind at all. Now, he may have been very critical of Indians in certain cultural ways, but not in the way we could just easily dismiss and say, oh, he was racist. The categories didn't exist scientifically in the way that they would a few generations later, or even a generation later. So he very happily took an Indian orphan. In fact, his mother was about to commit ritual suicide, and Jackson adopted that boy and had no problem with that. This was not an issue for him at all. In fact, he had very strict rules when he fought Indians. He did not attack women or children, and he tried to arrest certain whites who did attack Indian women and children. In fact, he was furious about this and thought that they should be given the death penalty, whites who would do this. But when it came to open warfare with males, this was true. It's true with the Spanish as it was with the Indians, as it was with runaway blacks. He was ruthless. There's no question about that. If you went against Jackson, he would take you down. But you did have to be a male, and you had to be a soldier. Otherwise, he wasn't going to do it. So, again, I think we could say, look, this isn't necessarily good, but he did have a certain ethic there that was basically a kind of ruthless just war theory in a lot of ways. But there was an ethic there.
Okay. Now, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, you note in particular.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Now as I remember, pretty much destroys the Indian forces at that battle. But the context, which I thought made sense, was this was something that people have been pointing to for generations, to finally have that area and to have it safe for settlers to move in. And so this was what he was fighting for. It was sort of all the marbles.
That's
there.
right.
Yeah.
And of course, he had some Creeks on his side. right? There were a number of Creeks who were fighting with him. So there was, as typical, and this is a really sad part of American Indian history. Of course, there were tribal conflicts, intertribal conflicts, and civil wars, which, whether the whites intentionally exacerbated those or not, they were exacerbated by whites taking sides with one sub-tribe versus another. And in that case, with Horseshoe Bend, with the Creeks there in particular, the Creeks that Jackson was going against had been making all kinds of overtures to the Spanish. And there was a lot of worry that with those overtures to the Spanish, that basically there could be British infiltration through the Spanish in those areas and through the Creeks. So we do know that when the British finally do invade in that region, at least through New Orleans, they did have written orders from the British government, not only to seize land, but to reclaim it in the name of Britain. This was not a mere harassment exercise. They were fully trying to reclaim land. Now, granted, that's 2 years later, but I think Jackson had a sense of what was going on there and what might happen had these Indians, the Creeks, our enemy Creeks in that region, secured it for enemy action.
So thinking about this is sort of Jackson's myth. I mean, I think this is how it would have been built in his day. Or not so much a myth, but sort of his persona would have been built by these battles, these victories, and also going into Florida. In pursuit of various marauders leaving Florida territory. And so he goes, I go in pursuit of them, presumably not in violation of international law or something like that. He goes in pursuit of them, and he hangs 2 British agents.
That's right. Absolutely.
And this leads to sort of an immense debate in Washington over Jackson's actions, the legality, what he has implicated America in potentially, what do we do with Florida now? Is it ours? Things like this. So kind of talk about that and sort of
absolutely
how that sort of would have ingratiated him or not.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the most interesting things. There are a couple of points to make about this, Richard. So if I start straying too much down a rabbit hole, just let me know. But I am fascinated by this was also something I'd not really thought about. I was absolutely fascinated by the overseas reaction to Jackson and how much the Europeans both respected and hated and feared him at the same time. The Spanish and the British are just quaking in their boots about Andrew Jackson. He is the Napoleon of the woods, and they know he's a fierce guy, and they really don't want to mess with him unless they absolutely have to. So anytime Jackson is really rattling his saber, whether during the War of 1812 or right after, European powers are noticing, even when Americans maybe are taking it for granted. So that's one point I think is critical to make. The other one, and I had suspected this, and I had drawn upon the work of Ian Scoble and a couple of others looking at militias during the War of 1812. I had always, even though I've studied this era my whole adult life, I had always been really curious about the relationship between private armies and public armies, that is, between our militias, both state and local, and then, of course, the U.S. Army. And what I came to find, and I was very open about this, I mean, I tried to be at least, I was stunned at how gray the area was between what was officially sanctioned by the U.S. Army and what was not, and how much space there was to maneuver in that area that was neither totally private nor totally public. So when Jackson is running around in both the War of 1812 and afterwards, it is never totally clear on what sanction or whose sanction he has to go into these areas. Sometimes it really is just Jackson saying, look, I've got my Freemasons, I've got some free blacks, I've got a couple of French pirates, and I've got some Indian troops, and we're going to raise hell against the British. And then there are other times the government seems to say, okay, Jackson's running wild, we need to give him some kind of sanction so we can restrain him. That's what's happening in Florida. Jackson does not seem to have any clear directive. And what we find in the debates coming out of Washington at the time is that, ironically, John Quincy Adams was his greatest supporter. John Quincy Adams is laying down the law in cabinet meeting after cabinet meeting saying, basically, you will back Jackson because otherwise I can't get anything done in negotiations with the British or with the Spanish. And Calhoun, amazingly, is saying just the opposite. He wants Jackson arrested and tried for treason. So when you ask, and I don't want to get too far off this, Richard, because you asked a very specific question, and so it's a great question. What about these British officers who were executed? It's really not clear that Jackson had the right or was just in doing that. And I'm not convinced one way or the other that it was the correct move. There is no doubt that the British were creating all kinds of mischief in that region. I don't think that is questionable. Now, whether or not that warranted their execution, I just don't know, Richard. I wish I had an answer for you. But clearly Jackson, and he took responsibility for it, but he gave the trial over to 4 of his friends and said, you guys try these Brits, and whatever you decide, I'll back. Jackson was not directly involved, but he was ultimately responsible for it. And that means Monroe had to become responsible for it as president. And Monroe did not want to. But he decided ultimately it was best to side with Jackson than rather go against him on this issue. Yeah. So a lot of politics involved in that, I think.
I want to get to, after this next question, I want to get to Jackson's constitutional thinking and his political thinking. But one question here with Jackson, the British, it's not hard to say. I mean, we talk about so something else you would have learned in my day if you came up in Tennessee public schools is the song of the Battle of New Orleans. And so you have some observations on that battle and Jackson's role in leading it, but it's not too difficult to link this all the way back to when he's a young boy. And in the famous story, true story, of being lashed across the palm of his hands and his face with a sword for refusing to shine a British soldier's boots. Now that's one indicative of Jackson's character, that he would say no, and then also to receive that blow that would probably stay with you, particularly for a young man who comes up in an honor culture. So.
Oh, absolutely, Richard. And I'm sure you know this story. Until he died, he could still lay a full nail finger flat against his forehead, and it would not be in sync. That is, with the outside of his skull. That's how deep that gash was that he had gotten from a British soldier. And there were jokes made at the time that when especially in Tennessee, that when he was victorious at the Battle of New Orleans, which is one of the greatest victories America's ever had. It was so lopsided, it's outrageous. But at the time, people joked in Tennessee, well, you can imagine exactly what old Andy was thinking as he took out those 2,000 to 4,000 Brits there. And it's cruel, but it's true. I mean, Jackson's not going to get over that. And you can imagine him as a teenager, as a Scotch-Irish, quasi-Presbyterian, small-R Republican teenager, he's about to lose his mom and his whole family. He's in prison. This British soldier is harassing him. I have no doubt that Jackson just mouthed off with no qualm at all. And he got his beating for it. But I'm sure he was proud of that his whole life, that he had done that. So again, your honor culture comment is so apt. And I try to tell my students, watch Brave, the Disney movie, if you want to see what Celtic culture could be like for males at its most idiotic. And there it is. I mean, these guys they're so full blown in terms of their violence and so full of themselves. And I think that's a great, obviously a mythic and it's cartoon, but it's a great way of showing how deeply violent that culture could be. So Jackson, very much a victor, at least in his own mind, that honor.
And then Jackson comes back. Was it after the Battle of New Orleans? He comes back and he gets him basically like a drive-by shooting with his political enemies in Knoxville. Is it Knoxville or Nashville?
It's crazy. Yeah, I don't remember.
Violent culture.
Yes, so violent. So, and street fights at times. Right, that everybody knew was coming, but there it was. Yeah, well, and sometimes gang warfare.
And then also just thinking about our current politics. I mean, your book was as a point of reference. So they go after Jackson's mother. Jackson's mother, of course, died taking care of wounded colonials during the Revolutionary War. She got sick. Lost sons, if I remember.
Everybody. Everybody.
And they ridicule her as a prostitute to attack Andrew Jackson at one point in his political career, and then famously they attack Jackson's wife for her first marriage and all
Right.
sorts of allegations. So it's not as if politics was some sort of dignified debate in Jackson's period either. In fact, from
No,
what
it's not
I'm
the
reading,
Federalist Papers, right?
it's much worse. And yeah, you're going to get shot on the street of Nashville potentially. So, but
Yeah.
thinking about Jackson constitutionally
Well
and
put.
politically, who was he? You earlier in the interview you said sort of maybe a simple-minded republicanism, but this, as I read Jackson, this is a man that he deeply believed the Constitution was fundamental law, and you had to take it as it was written. And that's
right.
in a way that connects him directly to a lot of thinking today.
Yeah, and ironically, Richard, and I'm still kind of digesting this, and I had a lot of great conversations with Dan McCarthy as I was writing some of this. Dan has done some really good work on the old Republicans and John Randolph, and I was really surprised as well how much Jackson associated or thought he had associated with the old Republicans, with people like Nathaniel Macon and John Randolph and John Taylor of Caroline. He really saw himself as one of them, and it was one of the things that when he went against nullification in 1832 and 33, he was deeply concerned about this. In his diaries and his letters, he thought he'd betrayed his old friends. So there was a lot there, and he really did have that old, very restricted kind of anti-federalist, obviously not an anti-federalist because he loves the Constitution, but he believed in a very strict interpretation, like John Randolph would, of the Constitution. And that, you see that in a lot of different ways. And I think people will ask then, well, why was he so pro-executive power? And that was something I was always critical of as well. And what it struck me as in writing the book was that Jackson was no more pro-executive than John Marshall was pro-Supreme Court. That is, I don't think Jackson ever saw the executive branch as superior to the other two, but he thought that through the 18 teens and 20s, it had become subservient to the legislature, and he was doing what he can, maybe even an overreaction, to bring it back to an equality with those other branches. But and you brought this up, a good 40 minutes ago, this is where I think someone like Schlesinger did a real disservice to Jackson because he tried to play up that executive aspect and made him, I think, unconstitutional in many ways, in ways that Jackson wouldn't have recognized. Jackson is really, he's not a modern libertarian, obviously, but he would probably have more in common with, say, an Albert J. Nock during the 1930s than certainly he would have with a Franklin Roosevelt. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, no, yeah. His only difference over with Nock would be fighting. Probably.
Right. No, and Nock was more educated, obviously.
A little bit, yeah. So
and a better writer, right?
From the things you reprinted in your book, I think so. So Jackson, Jackson, constitutionally, we sort of talked about that. So what was the model American citizen for Jackson? I mean, on what did liberty rest as far as individual Americans were concerned?
Yeah, for him, he definitely loved Washington. I mean, Washington was his great hero, even though there were times even when in Congress, he had spoken against some of Washington's policies in terms of foreign policy. So he had served in Congress in the 1790s and then again in the 1820s. He wasn't good at it. He got too worked up in debate and couldn't really he wasn't articulate. He was never very articulate, both in the written word and the spoken word. But he did have a certain charisma, but he'd get so worked up in debates in Congress that he just turned red and sputter. So his motto really was Washington as the great American and constitutionalist. But, strangely enough, his probably greatest hero outside of his probably John Calvin and Christ, because he was a fairly devout Presbyterian. If we look at it just in terms of his actual politics, he loved William Wallace. William Wallace, the old Scottish patriot, Braveheart. Yeah. That was really his great model of what a man was. And as far as we know, he read what he could about Wallace. But he was, and you had asked this a little bit earlier or implied it, Richard, his mother was a sacred figure in his life, and his mother had wanted him to be a Presbyterian minister, which she had hoped Jackson would be until her death, and of course never knew what he would become, but had certainly thought that was his path. So, yeah, there's a lot of good there's a lot of Presbyterianism, a lot of smaller Republicanism, but then there's that Scotch-Irish element as well.
Thinking about Jackson, so one of the things he's very well known for is his opposition to the bank, to having a chartered bank of the United States. And that's also a profound way of thinking or insight into who he was and how he saw not only constitutional powers, but also how he thought about economics, which is interesting, which would be amenable in many ways to classical liberal libertarian thought, but yet he also had a profound moral underpinning to economics and to trade, which is worth discussing.
Yeah, and I'm not great on economics, Richard, so I'll just give you my viewpoint on this. Well, I mean, I think you're probably better than I am. But I know from reading Jackson that as much as he was a hard money man and a free trade, in very modern libertarian ways, was radically free trade and free immigration and, all of those things, I do think it does come down for Jackson to a moral question. As you say, there's no doubt that being free market was efficacious, but I think for him, even if it hadn't been, he still would have considered it moral. And in large part, he never had a good concept in any way that maybe Steve Horowitz might have in terms of how we might think of an abstract corporation, how we might think of a bank. For him, a banker was someone who had the gold and you borrowed from him, but you didn't create fiat money. So I often get asked, and I'm glad people are interested, but I get asked, well, is it terrible that Jackson's being taken off the $20 bill? And my response is always, well, culturally that's bizarre. But if you looked at Jackson and you told Jackson that he'd one day be on a fiat dollar, printed by basically the third bank of the United States, he'd be horrified.
Yeah.
The idea that he would be the representative of paper money, I think he probably would duel somebody.
Yeah.
So anyway, I obviously I'm being a little bit irreverent, but I do think there's something there very truthful as well that he would resent that he thought that, and he'd probably tell us to go back on the gold standard if we had any sense
but
or
Jackson,
morality.
Jackson even more radically than say Madison really thought the bank was corruption. I mean, it was corruption.
Well put, Richard.
Incorporated.
Yes.
And fostered all manner of problems throughout the country and throughout the economy. And it had to be rooted out. It had to be pulled up, roots and all. And that's how he understood its working. So we could say maybe he didn't. You sort of said this. He didn't really understand banking or central banking. But maybe one of the things he understood or thought he understood was we want to have an economy of equals, and I think that's how he thought of it. And by equals, he didn't want it. He didn't mean government bestowing certain favors or making it more likely that certain people would benefit more so than others. And I think we could all respect that.
Oh, absolutely. And you put it beautifully, Richard, better than I did. This is what we would now call crony capitalism, of course. Yeah. And that's exactly, he instinctively knew that if you put political power in the hands of economic giants, they would use it to their benefit and they would squeeze out people. That's exactly that. His whole bank statement and his bank veto, that as much as I regret that he says things such as, I am the spokesman of the people, sounding like Louis XIV. Yeah. When he says that, I'm sorry, he puts it in that language, but certainly I think he's right in his attacks on those people who are taking advantage of political laws. There's no doubt about that.
So we situate Jackson politically also. I mean, I always kind of think of this like, I don't know, Southern Republican, Virginia, Coastal Carolina wing, John Taylor of Carolina, you mentioned John Randolph of Roanoke. But there's also the Southerners, more the deeper Southerners, John Calhoun. And Jackson is going to be at the center of, after his presidency, what becomes the central political dispute of the country leading to the Civil War, and that's union or nullification or, states being given tremendous powers to govern themselves apart from the federal government. And Jackson opposes all of this vigorously, even though he would have agreed with them mostly on constitutional philosophy. But when it comes to this question of can the states nullify federal laws or restrict their interpretation and their implementation in their own states. He says firmly no. I think he's right about that. But yet this is the rift, and Jackson's at the heart of it. So maybe talk some about that and how why
Sure.
Jackson so strongly insisted upon union, and John Calhoun, his vice president, who also had worked to undermine him as his vice president, will go in the other direction.
Yeah, so, I think just to answer that in a twofold way, I think the first thing we do have to understand is that as much as Jackson believed in the power of the state, that is the local states, Kentucky and so forth, Tennessee, I think he did have a pretty strong view that the only way that there would ever be any kind of real constitutional balance was through a traditional federalism. That is, the Union did have to hold those things together. He is a unionist when push comes to shove. And I think he would have preferred not having to have broadcast that as he did and had to, as he felt he had to in 1832 and 33. I'm sure he would have wished that that would have not been an issue. In fact, I'm positive that he wished that. You see that in his letters going up to the event and after. But he also believed that once it came, and he had that duty, he had the duty to speak out against it and to defend the Union, but not as a nationalist. And that's where I think quite often, if we don't rely on people like Lee Cheek's work or on Forrest McDonald, states' rights and union, if we don't look at those works, if we start thinking in terms of you're either a nationalist or a states' writer, we're going to miss that via media there, that Jackson really did hold, that we do have to have a balance. And I think we could agree or disagree with that. My friend Tom Woods and I disagree about that pretty strongly. But, I understand Tom's point, and Kevin Gutzman as well. I get where they're coming from, and I see the dangers. But I don't see Jackson as a hardcore nationalist. He is a unionist, something in between. So he's pretty fierce about that. But the other thing to keep in mind for me, as the other part of the twofold comment or response to your question, Richard, is that there is really deep personal animosity there, not just political, not just kind of metaphysical, but truly personal animosity between not just Clay and Jackson, and not just John Quincy Adams and Jackson, but especially Calhoun and Jackson. And it's because Jackson had originally thought Calhoun was his ally. And this is one of those things. If you're Jackson's friend, you're set for life. He will be your friend forever. But if he feels you betrayed him, and that was as true, unfortunately, for his runaway slaves as it was for his friends, you're done. That's just it. He will have nothing to do with you again. So when he found those letters in the spring of 1830, when John C. Calhoun had been Secretary of War, and had advocated the arrest of Jackson, Jackson's just furious. This is his vice president now. And he expected that his vice president would have been honest about this. So it's not, Richard, it's not, I would love, and I think we could spend a lot of time talking about his constitutional policy, but I think when push comes to shove on that issue, there's so much personal animosity there that it's really difficult to separate Jackson's actual views of the Constitution from him just being really ticked off personally at Calhoun.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too, Jackson, in this, so the immediate point of discussion was the tariff bill and the rejection.
Right.
And the South rejects that. South is very free trade for obvious reasons, and rejects this tariff bill and says it's unconstitutional.
Right.
And so
the 1828.
Yeah. So, Calhoun.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Richard.
No, but, Calhoun, largely becomes, it seems in my mind, really becomes the theorist of the South, or the theorist of the Confederacy.
Oh, yeah, with the disquisition and the Fort. Oh, absolutely.
And
I
Jackson
agree.
offers a compromise on the tariff, I think.
Right.
But that's not enough. And then,
right.
then you get the force bill. But I think, what seems to be what's behind the force bill at Jackson's census is, what Calhoun is articulating with the concurrent majority is some sort of principle of anarchy. If everyone can decide,
interesting,
then the law really can't run anymore, and you weaken it, morally, and you weaken it in the eyes of the people. And I think, it seems to me Jackson probably knew that in his heart. Even if he wouldn't have articulated, Lincoln articulated it very clearly, that the principle of secession is the principle of anarchy.
Right.
But I just, as I was reading your book, I thought that. I don't know.
That is excellent. I like that, Richard, a lot. And I've got to take that. I've got to think about that more, because the way I teach it, and I always teach the disquisition, but the way I teach it, and I could be very wrong about this, but I usually argue that Calhoun's view is kind of a cross between Calvin's in Geneva and Cato the Elder in the way that he approached the Roman Republic with the multi-executives. But I think you're right. It's not just a kind of deep republicanism. There probably is a bit of anarchy in that as well. Yeah, I've got to think about that. That's great. I like that. That's something for me to puzzle about.
Yeah, but now we'll close. You included in the book Andrew Jackson's farewell address when he leaves the White House.
Right.
Why did you include it, and what do you make of that address?
You know, it's not one I had read before, and so I only came across it. I never even thought about reading it before. I only came across it because of the book. And it struck me, while it's not well written, it's nothing like Washington's farewell address or Eisenhower's farewell address in terms of style. I do think it had a really great point to make. And you notice that our history books always make Jackson the first capital D Democrat, the first head of the Democratic Party. I just could not find that. I could not find anywhere where Jackson called himself a Democrat. It's not in his private letters. And it's possible I missed something, but it strikes me as that's really Martin Van Buren's machinations and his Machiavellianism that is really putting that together and what the Democratic Party would be. What I always saw was Jackson referring to himself as a small R Republican. And that farewell address, which is clearly well thought out, if not well executed in its style, it really expresses that. And you combine his real desire for us to come back to first principles in that farewell address and to remember what the founders were trying to do and to get back to the idea of the Constitution. You compare that with his, I think, very important little letter that he wrote in 1845 saying, "You will make no mausoleum for me. I was a Republican. No Republican president deserves a monument to him after his death." That would be unbecoming. You put those two things together, his farewell address and his last will on that issue. And, as much as I love Reagan, I still feel uncomfortable with the Reagan Presidential Library. And I think Jackson understood that. We are not making mausoleums. We are not making tombs to these god kings. That is not what we are supposed to do. So that's, and I was surprised Regnery went for it. I thought, come on, this is a long address. It's not that well written. They'll never go for it. But they said yes immediately. And I'm so glad they did. And I had actually gotten the idea from when I had written on Charles Carroll. I found his CX letters, which were basically impossible to find anywhere except in one paper. His letters from 1776. Then ISI reprinted those. I was very happy, and I thought, well, let's try and do that here as well. I think in many ways, Richard, it may be the great. I mean, I hope what I had to say about Jackson was good, but I think in many ways, just the fact we reprinted that document is going to make that book mean something.
Let me read near the end, and we'll get your comment, and we'll bring our discussion to a close. So and this is maybe something we should hear today in particular. It is from within, among yourselves, from cupidity, from corruption, from disappointed ambition, and inordinate thirst for power, that factions will be formed and liberty endangered. It is against such designs, whatever disguise the actors may assume, that you have especially to guard yourselves. You have the highest of human trust committed to your care.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's worthy of Madison, right? I mean, it may even at some level, the thought at least may be worthy of Cicero. I think Jackson fundamentally understood that. And I don't think the presidency corrupted him. I think, if anything, this is a guy who weathered the temptations of the presidency for the most part. At least I have not found, I think we could argue about nullification, but I think he understood. I think he was humbled by it. He didn't walk away thinking, oh, look how great I am. I think he came away thinking, this is a mess. We've got to keep this. We've got to keep the people virtuous.
Well,
we have to.
It would seem as well, a man as hard as Jackson probably, would withstand with temptations better than others, maybe. There was, he was just never really going to be comfortable with anything.
I agree, Richard. Now, I'm no Calvinist, but I think his firm Calvinism, that kind of puritanical streak there, I think it served him well, very well.
Brad, thank you so much. We've been talking with Brad
Oh, it's
Birzer,
great, Richard.
author of In Defense of Andrew Jackson. Thank you so much. This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at LibertyLawSite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.